The Chime of Death by Peter Lamb. Chapter 1. The Guests Arrive. The rain had begun before noon, a gentle drizzle that soon thickened into a grey curtain sweeping across the Sussex countryside. Bell Hollow, perched on a hill like a forgotten jewel, stood firm against the storm, its ivy-clad stone walls glistening under the downpour. Once the secluded home of renowned clockmaker Edwin Bell, it now served as a boutique hotel for those drawn to eccentric luxury, and this weekend, the peculiar world of horology. The annual British Horological Society's private symposium was a niche affair. Only select invitees received the cream-colored parchment invitation sealed with a gold-embossed watch face. And this year the venue stirred a mix of curiosity and unease. Bell Hollow, home to secrets that ticked louder than any clock. Iris Lane arrived first. A writer of modest fame in mystery circles, she was more observer than participant in horology, but her invitation had come courtesy of her publisher, who thought the setting ideal for her next novel. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed behind stylish glasses, and wore her trench coat like armor. She stepped out of the taxi with a suitcase in one hand and a fedora tilted against the wind. "It looks like murder weather," she murmured to herself. By the time she crossed the threshold, the other guests had begun to arrive. Professor Ambrose Ryle, stiff as a pendulum, glared at the wet carpet with disdain as a butler took his sodden coat. His lectures on time theory were infamous for their dryness, but his temper, especially when challenged, was wetter than the storm outside. Next came Carmen Bell, the mysterious new owner of the manor. She had inherited the estate after the last of the Bell family died without an heir, or so the story went. Tall, composed, and elegant, Carmen's voice had the chill of wind through old gears. "Please, make yourselves at home. The clockmaker's house keeps time, but not always as you'd expect." Timothy Vance followed, all charm and slicked-back hair. An antique dealer with a taste for rare pieces and even rarer information, he winked at Iris as they passed in the hallway. Something about him suggested polished surfaces hiding deep scratches. Eloise Morton arrived last, quiet, almost forgettable, except for the way she stared at the grandfather clock in the foyer as though it whispered to her. The storm raged on, and as the guests settled in, the grandfather clock in the main hall let out a long, low chime. 12 strokes. Precisely 12. But it was the brief pause, followed by a faint 13th chime, barely audible over the thunder, that turned heads. "Did anyone else hear that?" Iris asked. No one answered. The clock stood silent once more, hands frozen at 8:59, and somewhere, deep within the walls of Bell Hollow, the gears of an old plan began to turn once again. Chapter 2. The Keynote and the Clock. Morning brought a pale light that filtered through the lace curtains of Bell Hollow like it had lost its way. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds washed clean, but the manor's long corridors still held a kind of hush, as though the walls were listening. Breakfast was served in the east dining room, where a long oak table had been polished to a mirror sheen. Croissants, steaming pots of coffee, and gleaming silver cutlery lent the illusion of ease. But underneath, a tension ticked, soft, almost imperceptible, like the coil of a watch winding tight. "Do you think the chime was a mechanical error?" Iris Lane asked, slicing into a poached egg. "Unlikely," Professor Ryle replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "The Bell Hollow clock was designed by Edwin Bell himself. A 13th chime would be a deliberate modification, not a fault." "Perhaps it's haunted," Carmen said, sipping her tea. "Or perhaps it's simply reminding us that time doesn't always play fair." At precisely 10 o'clock, a chime rang again. Just 12 this time, and the guests moved into the great hall for the keynote address. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its warmth offset by the cavernous ceilings. The centerpiece of the room remained the towering grandfather clock, 6 feet of mahogany, brass, and myth. Standing beside it was the keynote speaker, Dr. Bernard Tremaine, a wiry man in his 60s with a voice like sandpaper and eyes like ticking metronomes. His reputation preceded him. A once revered horologist, Tremaine had vanished from public life for nearly a decade before re-emerging with a book of controversial theories about Edwin Bell's lost inventions. "Ladies and gentlemen, fellow keepers of time, we gather here not merely to admire what has been built, but to question what has been hidden." He gestured to the clock behind him. "This clock is not what it seems. I believe, no, I know, that Edwin Bell embedded within it a secret, one that could change our understanding of horology forever. A murmur rippled through the room. Speculation. Edwin Bell was brilliant, but secret codes and buried inventions? That's the stuff of pulp novels. You mock what you don't understand, Ryle. But I have found fragments, blueprints, diaries, and tonight I intend to prove that this clock holds more than just time. Later that evening, the guests retreated to their rooms as the storm returned with renewed force. Wind howled through the chimneys. The clock struck midnight, 12 chimes, nothing more. At 1:13 a.m., a scream echoed through the manor. Iris was the first out of her room, robe drawn tight, heart thudding in her chest. She met Timothy Vance in the hallway, face pale. It came from the great hall. They ran. The grandfather clock's door stood open, pendulum swinging madly. Dr. Bernard Tremaine lay sprawled at the foot of the staircase, his skull cracked on the stone. Clutched in his hand was a pocket watch, its hands frozen at 1:13, and behind them the clock let out a faint 13th chime. Chapter 3: The Inspector's Arrival. By dawn, the storm had relented again, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The halls of Bell Hollow no longer whispered. They held their breath. Dr. Bernard Tremaine's body had been respectfully covered, but the echoes of his final fall lingered like the scent of spilled brandy and blood. Carmen Bell, as the property owner, had placed a call to the local constabulary just after 2 in the morning. A constable arrived before first light. But it wasn't until 7:30 a.m. that Inspector Jonathan Redfern stepped out of his unmarked car, trench coat flapping, brow furrowed beneath salt and pepper hair. Redfern was a man of method. Mid-50s, unassuming, and sharp as a razor, he had long ago given up cigars, but still chewed on toothpicks like they held secrets. He'd solved murders in Brighton, disappearances in Dover, and once uncovered a taxidermy ring in Eastbourne that gave him nightmares for weeks. He hadn't planned to spend the weekend in a manor full of clocks and academics. "Let's keep this simple," he said, shaking water from his hat. "You're all guests here. One of you may also be a killer." He examined the crime scene, where the antique pocket watch remained bagged on the table beside Tremaine's body. A watch stopped at 1:13. Symbolic or convenient? He moved to the grandfather clock, which now ticked steadily, innocently. But Iris Lane stood nearby, arms folded. "Inspector, I write murder mysteries for a living. This is no accident. Tremaine claimed he'd found a secret. That clock struck 13 again last night." "Are you suggesting the clock committed the murder?" "I'm suggesting someone used it as a message." Redfern took a slow breath. He'd dealt with eccentrics before, but something in Iris's tone made him pause. Not hysteria, conviction. The interviews began. In the drawing room, guests sat awkwardly spaced apart, each now a potential suspect. Professor Ryle was first. "Of course I had disagreements with Tremaine. He peddled nonsense, but I argue for a living. That doesn't make me a murderer." Timothy Vance next. "Sure, I'd offered to buy the clock last year, before Carmen inherited the place. But killing over a timepiece, that's not how I do business." Eloise Morton was pale, hands folded tightly in her lap. "He asked me about old repair manuals. Edwin Bell's personal notes. I said I didn't have them. I don't." Carmen Bell met Redfern's eyes evenly. "Dr. Tremaine claimed my great-uncle hid secrets in that clock. If he was right, perhaps someone didn't want those secrets revealed." Redfern took notes silently, brow twitching only once, when Iris Lane asked if she could see the pocket watch. "Why?" "Because it didn't stop at 1:13. It was set to 1:13. There's no shatter in the glass. No impact. Whoever left it in his hand wanted us to believe it had stopped in the moment of death." Redfern narrowed his eyes. For the first time, the mystery deepened not just into murder, but into performance. And in a manor full of collectors, scholars, and rivals, performance was always part of the game. Chapter 4: The Gear and the Guilt. After breakfast, the guests were told they were not to leave Bell Hollow until further notice. The gates remained closed. The constable parked at the foot of the driveway like a reminder. Someone here had blood on their hands, and they weren't leaving until Redfern was satisfied. Rain slicked the windows, and the ticking of the clocks, grandfather, mantle, wall-mounted, filled the manor with a relentless percussion. Time didn't slow here. If anything, it marched on louder in the absence of certainty. Inspector Redfern returned to the grandfather clock, this time with his gloves on. The mechanism was pristine, oiled with a care that bordered on reverence. No fingerprints on the brass pendulum, no scratches around the casing. But something had been tampered with. He could feel it. Why strike 13 when 12 would suffice? Because 13 is impossible, and the impossible always grabs attention. Iris Lane had entered silently, notebook in hand. "You seem to enjoy involving yourself, Miss Lane. I make a living out of asking the wrong questions until someone slips up." Redfern opened the rear of the clock. Nestled inside the lower compartment was a folded cloth, too modern to be original. Inside it, a small brass gear, notched irregularly, as if it had once belonged to a larger, more intricate mechanism. "This doesn't belong to this clock?" "No, but it might belong to the one Tremaine believed was hidden inside it." As Redfern bagged the gear, Carmen Bell appeared in the hall. She had changed into a deep green jumper, her dark hair tied back and her expression unreadable. "Inspector, I think you ought to see my great-uncle's study." The study was on the second floor, down a narrow corridor behind a false panel. The room was a horologist's dream and a conspiracy theorist's sanctuary. Stacks of blueprints, journals, and drawers full of brass, copper, and steel. Diagrams of escapements, annotations in spidery handwriting, and among them, sketches of the grandfather clock. But these sketches included additional components, sections of the clock that didn't exist in the current build or hadn't yet been discovered. Hidden chambers, pressure latches. This was more than a timepiece. It was a puzzle box. Meanwhile, in the parlor, Eloise Morton stared at her tea untouched. She looked up only when Timothy Vance entered. "You knew Tremaine longer than you admitted, didn't you?" "I met him once years ago, at an auction. He asked about a lost prototype, Bell's final clockwork theory. I told him I'd never seen it. But you had. You'd read about it in the journals you bought last spring in Devon. That's why you came here." She went rigid. Then, without a word, stood and walked away, her footsteps light but urgent. Redfern and Iris, still in the study, now examined one journal in particular. The final pages contained cryptic entries, ending abruptly. "If the gear is inserted at the stroke of 12, the door will open, but only with the correct rhythm. 13, the forbidden hour." Redfern closed the book. Tremaine wasn't just murdered, he was silenced before he could open the clock. And now someone else may be trying to finish what he started. Chapter 5. The Bell Legacy. Midday brought no comfort. The wind had shifted direction, sweeping down from the north and rattling the shutters of Bell Hollow with fresh malice. Inside, the manor seemed to hunch forward, as though listening again, waiting for something to move, click, chime, or kill. In the library, Carmen Bell stood before a tall glass cabinet that housed portraits of her ancestors. She stared longest at the small oil painting of Edwin Bell, his face a mix of stern concentration and mischief, as though the brush itself hadn't quite trusted him. "You always loved games, didn't you, Uncle Edwin?" Carmen had only met Edwin Bell once, on her 10th birthday. He'd given her a wooden box with no lock and no visible hinge, a toy puzzle she'd never solved. When he died, the manor was supposed to pass to the historical Horology Trust, but the will had changed at the last moment, naming her the sole heir. There had been whispers, forgery, madness, revenge, none proven. Redfern joined her, hands behind his back. "You never studied horology, yet you kept the manor exactly as he left it. Why?" "Because I knew there was something he wanted found, something he never told the world. I just didn't expect someone would die trying to find it." Redfern considered her for a moment. Then, "Do you know who sent Tremaine the letter inviting him here?" "I assumed it came from the Horological Society. They booked the weekend. I simply provided the venue." But when Redfern checked with the society via telephone, he received a curious reply. Tremaine had not been officially invited at all. His attendance was unsolicited. Someone had lured him here. Meanwhile, in her room, Eloise Morton opened a velvet pouch hidden in the lining of her suitcase. Inside was a second brass gear, smaller, older, and notched in the exact same pattern as the one Redfern had found. She stared at it for a long time. "You were right, Bernard. He built the mechanism. But I'm not the one who should unlock it." She returned the pouch to her case and locked it. In the billiards room, Iris Lane sat opposite Timothy Vance, the air thick with smoke from his cigar. He had the kind of face that always looked like it was calculating the odds and never betting on anyone else's hand. How long have you known Carmen Bell? A year, maybe more. We crossed paths in the auction world. She's got a keen eye for legacy, but not for detail. That's where people like me come in. Meaning you help people find things that belong in vaults? Meaning I know the value of things other people overlook, especially when those things tick. The conversation was interrupted by a faint sound. 13 chimes again, distant, like a memory repeating itself through wood and air. They both froze. That came from the clock. They ran. Carmen and Redfern were already in the hall. The grandfather clock stood open again, but now something had changed. The base panel, previously sealed, had shifted slightly ajar. Inside was a shallow compartment lined in velvet. And in it, a small black box, no bigger than a book, with the Bell family crest etched into the top. Redfern reached for it, hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a folded parchment, a winding key, and a name etched in brass, to be unlocked only at the final hour by the one who hears the 13th. Everyone stood still. Someone had opened it. Someone else had heard the 13th chime long before Tremaine ever died. Chapter 6, The Clockmaker's Code. The velvet-lined box was now on the table in the drawing room, its contents laid out with surgical care, the parchment, the ornate winding key, and the brass plaque that read, "To be unlocked only at the final hour by the one who hears the 13th. Inspector Redfern stood at the hearth, arms crossed, the fire reflecting in his eyes. Iris Lane paced the room like a cat watching shadows. What is the final hour? A metaphor? Or is this clock hiding more than we think? In Edwin Bell's journals, he hinted at designing a mechanism that could only be activated through an exact rhythm. The 13th chime, it's not a malfunction, it's a key. Redfern looked at the parchment. The writing was dense, cursive, and mechanical all at once, precise lines, deliberate spacing. It wasn't a letter. It was a code. At the top, a single sentence stood out. The rhythm of truth lies where silence breaks the pattern. In her room, Eloise Morton sat by the window, the second brass gear now in her palm. Her thumb brushed the notches. She had tried for years to understand Bell's final design. She'd come to Bell Hollow to chase a theory, not to witness a murder. You should have waited, Bernard. She closed her fist around the gear and stared into the storm-drenched garden below. That afternoon, Iris and Redfern examined the clock again. The panel inside the case now revealed something new, a tiny circular slot, just the size of a gear. He meant it literally. The 13th chime unlocks the clock. This is no ordinary mechanism. It's a vault. Redfern inserted the gear found earlier. It clicked into place, but nothing moved. No shift, no sound. We're still missing something. The gear alone isn't enough. The winding key. The rhythm. They took the key, inserted it into the central dial, and turned it, not rhythmically, but in the sequence detailed on the parchment. Pause, turn, pause, 2 turns, wait. A ticking began inside the wood. Slow. Deliberate. Then a click. A hidden drawer slid open behind the base panel of the clock. Inside was a leather-bound journal, aged and cracked. But before they could open it, Carmen Bell stepped forward. That's not yours. Miss Bell, this is evidence in a murder investigation. Unless you'd like to tell me why Tremaine died trying to find this? Because he thought it proved he was right. He believed Edwin Bell had invented something more advanced than anything of his time. He wanted to exploit it, to publish, sell it, become famous again. She walked to the hearth, her voice steadier now. But this journal is proof of something else entirely, that Edwin Bell built a device that could distort time perception, a mechanism to influence memory and awareness. He called it the Chronos Latch, and he buried it in this clock to protect it. You expect me to believe your uncle invented psychological time manipulation? No, I expect you to believe someone murdered to keep it buried. Everyone froze, because Carmen's eyes weren't on Redfern or Iris. They were on Eloise Morton, who had entered the room quietly, her expression unreadable. You had the other gear, didn't you? Eloise's lips parted slightly, her hand slipped into her coat pocket, but didn't come out. Redfern took a step forward. Miss Morton, please put your hands where I can see them. She hesitated, then slowly withdrew the gear and placed it on the table. I wasn't going to destroy it. I wanted to understand it. But Iris was already turning the final page of the journal. Her eyes widened. There's a list, names, coordinates, dates, some of them in the future. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was electric, Something had just shifted in the manor. Again, not in gears or wood, but in truth. And someone in this house still wanted that truth hidden. Chapter 7. The Future That Never Was. The fire had died to embers, but no one moved to rekindle it. The leather-bound journal lay open like a wound on the drawing-room table. Around it, the guests stood as if tethered, drawn into Edwin Bell's strange, spiraling secrets. The list inside the journal was baffling. August 18, 1973, Geneva. March 4, 2002, Kyoto. November 6, 2025, Bell Hollow. These aren't past events, they're timestamps, future appointments, markers in time for something to occur. If you're suggesting Edwin Bell could predict the future, I'm suggesting he may have believed he could manipulate it. Eloise Morton sat alone in the breakfast room, the gear she surrendered now replaced by the weight of consequence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she poured herself tea she wouldn't drink. You said no one would get hurt, Bernard. You promised it would only be theory. Back in the drawing room, Carmen stood beside the grandfather clock once more, her hand resting on the wood like it was still alive. The gears inside had stopped ticking. Again, silence reigned. This house is a tomb. My great-uncle buried himself in it, and now his work has risen like a curse. Timothy Vance had said little since the discovery of the secret compartment. He now leaned against the doorway, arms folded, eyes locked on the journal. The antique market has whispered about Bell's final piece for decades. They called it the Watchman's Heart. Some said it was an allegory. But this is real. And if that mechanism does what the journal claims, then the murderer didn't just want to stop Tremaine from revealing it. They wanted it for themselves. Redfern snapped the journal shut. The room seemed to exhale. This isn't about horology anymore. It's about motive and opportunity. Tremaine knew what the 13th chime unlocked. Someone else did too, and they killed to be first. That evening, Redfern had each guest's room searched. Luggage was opened, drawers examined, journals, watches, receipts catalogued. Most were mundane, except for a crumpled telegram found in Professor Ryle's shaving kit. From T. Vance, the final gear is at Hollow. You know what to do. Ryle was summoned immediately. It wasn't me, Vance. He baited me with it. I never even responded. You had motive. You called Tremaine a fraud in print. You were excluded from his book. You wanted to disprove him. Yes, I hated him, but not enough to kill him. Redfern turned to Vance, who raised his hands, smirking faintly. I never said he should kill anyone. I just wanted a distraction, something to rattle Tremaine into showing his cards. So you manipulated both of them for a clock. For what's inside the clock, and I'm not the only one here who would. At that moment, the grandfather clock struck once, just a single resonant chime. Everyone stared, one chime, at the wrong time. And on the wall beside the clock, a shadow that hadn't been there before, the silhouette of someone standing still, watching. Chapter 8. The Shadow in the Clocklight. The single chime faded into the hush, but the shadow on the wall remained, tall, narrow, frozen like a smudge of ink against stone. For a breathless second, no one moved. Then Iris turned slowly, eyes tracing the origin of the silhouette. That shadow doesn't match anyone in this room. Inspector Redfern stepped forward, hand instinctively near his sidearm, though he wasn't the sort to draw first. Check the hallway. Now. The guests spilled out, each heart pounding with the certainty that someone else had just been in the room and left behind no trace. But the corridor was empty. No footprints, no open doors. And the clock ticked on, each tock a reminder that time was not theirs to command. Back in her room, Carmen Bell opened the drawer beneath her writing desk and pulled out a dusty, cloth-wrapped item. Inside, a delicate watch with no hands, just a blank, mirrored face that reflected nothing but the ceiling. It had belonged to Edwin Bell. You said it would only show the future when time stopped listening. She placed the watch flat on the desk. It began to glow faintly, and as she stared into it, her pupils dilated. A tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered again, "It wasn't supposed to be real." In the library, Iris returned to the journal. One passage burned into her memory. When the chime lands where no hour lies, the door opens not to space, but to certainty. She underlined it 3 times. This isn't a time machine, it's an oracle, a device meant to trap the future, not visit it. Redfern joined her. You think this was Bell's intention, to give someone the ability to see what's coming? No, to prevent it, but someone misunderstood. Someone believed it could be harnessed. Downstairs, Eloise Morton stood before the grandfather clock again. Her eyes were red, her blouse wrinkled, her entire frame tense with guilt. She placed the second gear in her palm, then raised it toward the now unlocked compartment, only to stop. "Forgive me, Edwin. I should never have tried to finish your work." She dropped the gear into the fire. It hissed, warped, melted. The clock responded with a metallic groan. A spring snapped deep within its wooden ribs. Then silence. In the drawing room, the mirrored watch on Carmen's desk cracked down the middle. In the library, the journal burst into flame from the center outwards, without spark or source. And in the hallway, where the shadow had appeared, a single drop of blood hit the floor. The past was consuming itself, and someone, maybe everyone, was running out of time. Chapter 9. The Blood That Ticks. The air in Bell Hollow had changed. It was thicker now, charged with the bitter scent of burnt parchment and the metallic tang of unease. In the hall, beneath the sconces that flickered like gaslights from another century, Redfern knelt beside the single drop of blood staining the floorboards. Fresh, no smear. Whoever left this was standing still. He looked up and saw something else. A tiny brass splinter wedged into the paneling beside the blood. Not from a weapon, from a mechanism. Iris Lane was still coughing from the smoke that had erupted from the journal. Redfern had stamped it out with a damp curtain, but it was gone, destroyed with surgical precision, as though something inside wanted to be forgotten. We're not dealing with a murder anymore. We're inside an unfinished machine, and it's breaking itself to protect something. The brass splinter in Redfern's gloved hand wasn't just from the clock. It was from a hidden blade. Not a knife, but a tiny spring-loaded spike designed to trigger when a mechanism was tampered with. A trap. Someone had booby-trapped the inner workings of the clock, and when the gear was destroyed, it had fired a failsafe. Someone had been wounded. Get everyone in the Great Hall. Now. The guests stood gathered once again beneath the looming presence of the grandfather clock. Thunder growled faintly beyond the glass as Redfern walked the line, eyes sharp. One of you is injured. One of you triggered a mechanism inside this clock meant to protect whatever Bell buried. That trap wasn't accidental. It was designed to maim or kill, and someone here was caught by it. He watched faces carefully. Professor Ryle was sweating, but that was nothing new. Timothy Vance looked amused, arms folded, shoes gleaming. Carmen Bell's hands were at her sides, but the faint tremor in her left wrist betrayed her. Then there was Eloise Morton, one sleeve buttoned, the other slightly wrinkled, and a smear of red at the cuff. "Miss Morton, please remove your jacket." Eloise hesitated. Then, slowly, she peeled off the coat. Her forearm was bandaged with a makeshift wrap, torn from a linen napkin, already stained. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I wanted to see the truth, to finish what Edwin started, but he built the mechanism to keep everyone out, including me. You tampered with evidence at an active murder scene, and you kept it hidden. Because the truth doesn't matter if it's found too late. Tremaine was arrogant. He would have shouted the discovery from the rooftops, and someone couldn't let that happen." Iris stepped forward. "You're speaking like you didn't kill him, but you still know who did." Eloise said nothing. Redfern walked to the clock, inserted the remaining winding key. The mechanism inside refused to turn. "Someone has already finished the sequence." He turned to the group. "Tremaine didn't open the vault. The killer did. And that killer is still standing in this room." The clock struck once, then again, 3 chimes. At 4 minutes past the hour, each guest looked at the others, but no one confessed, because the clock was still ticking, and death might not be done with Bell Hollow yet. Chapter 10. The Man Who Wasn't There. The 3 errant chimes echoed through Bell Hollow like a riddle waiting to be solved. They didn't belong to any hour. They didn't match any known rhythm, but they sounded deliberate, an announcement from the clock that something had shifted again. Inspector Redfern stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He had seen every kind of lie, the kind told to preserve a secret, the kind told to protect someone else, and the most dangerous kind, the lie that convinced even the liar. "I've been looking at this all wrong," he said aloud. "We've focused on who killed Tremaine, but maybe the better question is, who wasn't meant to be here at all?" He turned toward Carmen. "The guest list. Who invited whom?" Carmen hesitated. I received the Society's formal letter with the list 2 weeks prior, but now, with what we've learned, I'm beginning to question if I was sent a forgery. Redfern walked over to a writing desk and produced the guest register, handwritten entries upon arrival. 6 names. Iris Lane, Professor Ryle, Timothy Vance, Eloise Morton, Carmen Bell, Bernard Tremaine. He paused. 6 people, but I have 7 sets of muddy boot prints by the main entrance. Everyone went still. You think someone else is in the house? Redfern opened the small linen cupboard by the stairs. A damp overcoat hung there. Dark brown, waxed canvas, no name tag. It didn't belong to anyone in the house, and it was still wet. Eloise backed into the library, hand pressed to her injured arm. Her breathing was shallow. She hadn't told them everything. She couldn't. Not without bringing the wrong kind of truth to light. She slipped behind the bookcase and pressed her fingers against a small indentation in the wood. A panel clicked. Inside was a narrow passage, old, cold, and filled with cobwebs. Edwin Bell had installed secret walkways throughout the house, for repairs, for eavesdropping, for control. Iris and Redfern now stood before the grandfather clock again. The 13th chime isn't just a signal, it's a test. The mechanism reacts to more than gears. I think it was designed to respond to presence. Presence. Like a motion sensor, but mechanical. It knows when someone's near, maybe even when someone shouldn't be. Redfern gestured for silence. The house had gone quiet again, too quiet. Then, from inside the walls, they all turned. The knock came again. Redfern drew his torch and followed the sound to the west corridor, past the old bell tower door. He pushed open a hidden panel revealed earlier in the week by a renovator. Inside stood a narrow man with spectacles, thin hands, and a face drained of color. I didn't mean to stay hidden. I only wanted to see if it worked, if Bell's work really worked. His name was Victor Ellery, a reclusive engineer and fringe theorist. He hadn't signed in, he hadn't been invited, but he knew how to enter. And he had been watching them for days. So you're the man who wasn't there. Not anymore. And behind them, the grandfather clock began to tick again, but backwards. Chapter 11. The Clock Reversed. The ticking reversed in soft clicks, like the sound of dripping water in a forgotten tunnel. One by one, every guest at Bell Hollow turned to stare at the grandfather clock. Its second hand now moved backwards, sweeping in slow defiance of natural time. Victor Ellery stood in the center of the great hall, arms by his sides, palms open, not in surrender, but as if waiting to be understood. He said it would happen. He wrote it in the margins. When truth is violated, the clock will turn back, not to correct, but to reveal. Redfern moved forward cautiously, but it was Iris who asked the question that needed asking. You've been in the walls, watching us. Did you kill Tremaine? No, I followed him here, because he stole Edwin Bell's final schematic. He planned to auction it. He had no right. So, you broke in, hid like a rat, but if you didn't kill him, who did? Victor's eyes welled up. He opened the mechanism. It activated, and something came through. A chill ran through the room, not from wind or fear, but from something more primal, a recognition of the unnatural. Came through what, Mr. Ellery? Through the gear sequence. The vault. Bell wrote of the temporal void, a pocket of suspended awareness. He claimed the clock, when wound with both keys and calibrated with exact rhythm, could act as a conduit, not to the future or past, but to the consequence of tampering with time. The air around the clock shimmered faintly now. It was subtle, like the heat rising from summer asphalt, but everyone could see it. The backward ticking grew louder. In the library, a vase cracked without cause. In the kitchen, the icebox clicked open and closed on its own. In the upper hallway, the portrait of Edwin Bell fell from the wall and shattered on the floor, revealing behind it a crude inscription, carved into the plaster. Who breaks the 13th, breaks the hour. Eloise Morton stepped forward, face pale, arm still bandaged. I read that in one of his unpublished manuscripts. I thought it was metaphorical, a cautionary line I never imagined. I don't believe in ghosts, machines that think, or clocks that whisper doom, but something here has broken the natural order, and until I understand what, no one leaves. Redfern had just finished speaking when the clock struck once, a single, jarring chime, then again, then a third. And with the fourth strike, the entire mechanism shuddered, gears skipping, wood creaking as though under great pressure. It's not just reversing time, it's rewinding events. They turned to the wall where Tremaine's blood had stained the panel. It was gone. The wood was clean. And at the base of the stairs where he'd died, the stone was undisturbed. No sign of the fall. No body. No blood. Dr. Bernard Tremaine was no longer dead. He was no longer anywhere at all. Chapter 12. The Hour Unwritten. The silence that fell over Bell Hollow was unlike anything that had come before. Not the hush of fear, not the stillness of suspicion. This was the absence of continuity. A gap in reality. Something essential had been undone. Inspector Redfern stood frozen at the base of the staircase where, moments before, the body of Dr. Bernard Tremaine had lain. But now, the stone was dry. The blood was gone. The shattered pocket watch, the crumpled limbs, the glassy stare, erased as if time itself had redacted the death. I watched him fall. So did we all, but now he never did. Victor Ellery stood back from the group, eyes wide with panic. He shook his head violently, like a man waking from a dream that refuses to fade. This wasn't supposed to happen. The device was meant to reveal truth, not erase it, not rewrite it. Carmen Bell stepped forward, her voice unnervingly calm. You activated the final rhythm, didn't you? The one no one else could decipher. I only wanted to witness the Chronos latch, to see if Bell's theories were real. I didn't know it would correct history. No, not correct. Replace. The 13th chime is an overwrite signal. Edwin Bell didn't invent a clock. He invented an editor of time, a mechanism that isolates a moment and deletes its consequences. The guests looked around, suddenly unsure of their own memories. What else had been rewritten? What else had been undone? I remember speaking to Tremaine last night after dinner, but that conversation never happened, did it? Not anymore. In the great hall, the grandfather clock now stood still. No ticking, no chimes, just the slow, deliberate creak of the house as if it too were adjusting to the new reality. Redfern's world had always been one of evidence, blood, motive, witnesses. But now the body was gone, the crime unwritten, the motive untraceable. You can't arrest what never happened. But Iris Lane wasn't finished. She crossed to the base panel of the clock and reached for the velvet-lined box. Inside was the broken key. The brass gear that Eloise had destroyed in the fire had melted, yes, but the Chronos latch had responded anyway. It doesn't need the parts anymore. The mechanism is complete. It's running a recursive pattern. We're inside a closed circuit of time. Carmen closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. What if the true purpose of the clock wasn't to reveal truth or erase the past, but to trap those who seek either? Suddenly, the grandfather clock gave one long, drawn-out chime, not a note of time, but a note of warning. The floor beneath it shifted with a loud clunk. A panel slid open in the wall behind it, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. No one spoke, because every one of them knew, if Tremaine's death had been erased from the timeline, then perhaps someone else's would soon take its place. Chapter 13. Down the 13th step. The narrow stone staircase revealed behind the clock descended in a tight spiral cut into the foundations of Bell Hollow like a secret the house itself had tried to forget. Damp air wafted upward, cool, ancient, and tinged with rust. It smelled like regret. Inspector Redfern went first, flashlight in hand. Iris Lane followed close behind, notebook tucked under one arm, every footstep measured. Carmen Bell, Eloise Morton, and, reluctantly, Victor Ellery descended together, the echo of their movement swallowed by the stone. No one goes back up until I say so. If this is where the truth lives, we bring it into the light. The passage opened into a vaulted chamber beneath the house, an old workshop untouched by time. Oil lanterns hung from rusted hooks. Drawers lined the walls, each labeled in Edwin Bell's meticulous hand. Escapements, balance springs, prototypes, fail-safe designs. And at the center of the room stood a work table, covered in a single velvet cloth. This was his heart, the room he locked away from everyone, even family. Redfern peeled back the cloth. Underneath was a device unlike anything they had seen before. Brass bones, copper veins, a centerpiece that pulsed faintly with warmth. It resembled a clock in the same way a human skull resembles a face, recognizable, but disturbingly incomplete. The Chronos latch. It exists. He finished it. Beside the machine lay a sealed journal. Iris opened it, revealing sketches of the mechanism and a final entry in ink that had barely faded. To seal the latch, one must write a moment. Not truth, not fiction, merely potential, and it shall come to pass. He didn't just build a machine that manipulates time, he built a typewriter for causality. Whoever writes the moment controls the next event. Eloise took a step backward, her breath shallow. That means Tremaine's death wasn't a glitch. Someone wrote it, just like someone wrote it away. Redfern examined the mechanism closely. His fingers hovered over a brass dial marked in strange increments, not hours or minutes, but symbols. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he knew the feeling of staring at something powerful and not meant for mortal hands. Someone has used this recently. It's warm. Victor looked to Carmen. You knew it was here. You let us down. Why? Carmen didn't flinch. Because I've used it before. Everyone froze. Once, a long time ago, after my uncle died and the inheritance was contested, I was about to lose everything, so I came down here, read his notes, and wrote a moment. She held their gaze. The will is authentic. The next day, the solicitor found a misplaced page. The court ruled in my favor. Bell Hollow became mine, and I swore I'd never use it again. Redfern turned to Iris. If Carmen wrote to protect herself, someone else has now written to kill. This isn't a murder mystery anymore. It's an arms race with time. And as he spoke, the Chronos latch gave off a soft ticking sound, its first heartbeat in decades. Then came the 13th chime. And above them, on the floor they had just left, a scream tore through the manor like fabric, ripping across reality. Chapter 14. The Moment That Shouldn't Be. The scream echoed down the stone staircase, sharp and raw, bouncing off the walls of the hidden chamber like a warning bell. Inspector Redfern was already moving, flashlight beam cutting a jagged path through the darkness. Iris Lane followed, pulse pounding in her ears. Someone stayed behind. By the time they reached the great hall, the others were gathering at the foot of the staircase. The grandfather clock stood silent. The shadow of its long body stretched across the floor like a coffin lid, and lying beside it, sprawled, motionless, mouth agape, was Timothy Vance. He was dead. Eyes open. No sign of blood, no sign of struggle, just a smear of something silvery at his temples, like powdered mercury, and the unmistakable odor of scorched ozone in the air. The latch must have shifted again. Someone wrote this moment into being. How? We were all together, no one wrote anything. Unless it was written before we went downstairs, the sequence was already running. We just hadn't reached this point in the pattern yet. Victor Ellery knelt beside the body, checking for any sign of life. There was none. But the watch in Vance's pocket, an antique Patek Philippe, was ticking backward. This is a retrograde moment. The latch didn't just erase Tremaine. It started rewriting successive points. Anyone tied to the clock's secrets is now a target of revision. Her gaze locked on the grandfather clock. It's not just about who used it, it's about who knows. The Chronos latch is cleansing the timeline of contamination, starting with those who understand it. Then we need to finish this, before it finishes us. Back in the hidden workshop, Eloise had returned alone, drawn by something unspoken. The machine stood quiet now, the dials were still, but the final page of Bell's journal, half scorched, remained. She opened it with trembling fingers. A moment unwritten is a moment uncontrolled. Beware the passive scribe. It is not always the writer who shapes destiny, but the one who leaves the ink well full. Someone's not writing on purpose, letting the machine decide. Redfern ordered the house locked from the inside. Doors bolted. Windows latched. Until we know who's manipulating the clock or who's letting it run wild, we treat this like a crime scene caught in a time loop. No one else dies. Understood? But Iris, staring at Vance's lifeless form, knew better. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a draft with no editor, and someone is going to keep rewriting it until the ending suits them. The grandfather clock let out one faint tick, then another. But this time, it wasn't counting backwards or forwards. It was counting inward. Chapter 15, The Writer in the Walls. The ticking had changed. Not reversed, not paused, not even chaotic. It was internal now, measured and deliberate, like the sound of thought itself. And Bell Hollow, with its dripping walls and groaning beams, had become less a house and more a head with a mind of its own. Iris Lane stood at the window of the drawing room, staring at her reflection in the glass. The rain had stopped. The fog outside was thick, curling around the trees like smoke. In the silence, her own heartbeat felt too loud. Something was watching. Not from outside, from within. The passive scribe. Inspector Redfern and Carmen Bell returned to the hidden workshop beneath the clock, this time alone. The chrono's latch sat dormant now, its gears still, its brass arms folded inward like a trap that had already sprung. You said you used it once, but someone else has been using it repeatedly. Who else knew it existed? Only me and Edwin Bell, and perhaps someone who read what they weren't supposed to. Carmen opened one of the nearby drawers marked failsafe designs. Inside were dozens of crumpled sketches, all incomplete, most discarded. But one drawing stood out, a hollow wall section, a hidden compartment, and at its center, a mechanical pen. My uncle didn't write in ink. He designed a mechanism to write for him, a mechanical ghostwriter. Redfern's brow furrowed. The latch isn't being used anymore. It's writing itself. Someone set it in motion and gave it instructions that outlived them. In the corridor outside the upper bedrooms, Eloise wandered, eyes glazed. Her memories of the past day were fraying at the edges. She could no longer remember what Tremaine had said to her, only that it had once been important. She pressed her palm to the wall, the wood felt warm, and then she heard it. Scratching, from inside the wall. Not rats. Not wind. Writing. No, please don't write me out. Iris flipped through the burnt remnants of Edwin Bell's final journal, trying to reconstruct entries from the charred corners. She began writing her own timeline beside it. Who died? Who vanished? What was changed? Each revision circled back to a moment where someone observed but did not act. A passive scribe doesn't kill. They allow. They don't control the ink. They just refill the pen. She stood suddenly and called out, "Victor Ellery!" Downstairs, Victor froze where he stood in the kitchen. He looked around as though someone had whispered his name into the gas pipes. "You didn't kill Tremaine. You didn't touch Vance. But you found the mechanical writer. And you fed it. You gave it ideas, phrases, instructions. Maybe not murders, but suggestions. What if? What if? What if? I just wanted to understand. And now the house is doing the writing for you." A bell chimed faintly, not the grandfather clock, but a smaller tone somewhere in the walls. A bell tied to the writer's hand, and the writing had begun again, words no one could see, moments not yet lived, and somewhere in those unseen lines, another death was already forming. Chapter 16, The Page That Bleeds. The house had turned inward. Every corridor felt narrower, every stair steeper. Time no longer moved in straight lines but folded in on itself, minutes repeating, glances exchanged and forgotten, a door that opened twice without ever being closed. Bell Hollow was becoming the story it was writing, and the next chapter had already begun. Iris Lane sat in the study, piecing together the few remaining fragments of Edwin Bell's scorched journal. She had assembled a crude timeline, names and events, deaths and disappearances, and beside it an empty sheet of paper. A page she hadn't touched. But it was no longer blank. 3 words had appeared in trembling ink-black script. Next, Carmen Bell. It's choosing its own narrative. Carmen stood at her bedroom mirror, running a brush through her hair with a mechanical calm. But her hand paused mid-stroke as a drop of red bloomed on her neck, a bead of blood that hadn't been there seconds before. She turned her head. There was no wound, just skin and ink. A faint black line ran down the back of her shoulder like a pen stroke drawn along flesh. It curved, dipped, crossed itself. A letter. Then another. She ran to the sink and scrubbed, but the marks wouldn't fade. They were being written onto her. Oh God, I'm becoming a page. Redfern burst into the lower chamber, flashlight sweeping the corners of the workshop. Victor Ellery was gone. The Chronos latch was open. And the brass arm that held the auto-scribe quill was no longer still. It hovered inches above a scroll of parchment, ink dripping from the nib. Redfern watched in stunned silence as the machine began to write. She descends in fear. She finds her end in sound. Redfern turned and bolted back upstairs, heart racing. Carmen fled the bedroom, her shoulder burning, the letters still writing themselves along her collarbone and ribs. Down the hall, toward the stairs. Toward the ticking. The grandfather clock stood open, chiming faintly. Redfern reached the top of the stairs and saw her, Carmen frozen at the precipice of the landing, staring down into the clock's hollowed core. And from within it, a sound, not a tick, not a chime, but a whisper. In her own voice, she finds her end in sound. That's not me. She stepped back, and the floor beneath her gave way. Redfern lunged. Too late. Carmen Bell fell into the open core of the clock, down into the hollow shaft designed not for timekeeping but for containment. There was no scream, only the closing of a wooden door, gentle as a sigh. Iris arrived moments later, eyes wide, too late to stop what had already been written. On the parchment in the workshop, the final line formed. The ink dries, the page closes, she is no longer needed. The Chronos latch sat still again, but the paper was only half filled, and the pen was still dripping. Chapter 17. The ink remembers the night deepened, but the clocks no longer chimed. Bell Hollow had entered a state beyond time, where events unraveled not by seconds but by sentences. The manuscript of the house continued to write itself, and the ink, now thick and dark, remembered everything. Iris Lane stood alone in the chamber below, staring at the Chronos latch. The parchment trembled faintly in its iron clamps, the pen poised above its curling surface like a vulture. She could still see Carmen's name on the scroll, already crossed out. If it can erase her, it can erase any of us. Victor Ellery stepped into the workshop slowly, hands out in peace, but eyes wild with the desperate gleam of a man out of his depth. I didn't mean for her to die. I thought if I suggested possibilities, the machine would choose what was safe, logical. You let a clock think for you. That's not logic. That's cowardice. Inspector Redfern was searching Carmen's room for answers. Her journal, hidden under the mattress, held only cryptic thoughts and fragmented memories, dates that no longer happened, people she dreamed of but never met. And at the back, one note, written shakily, "If I disappear, I'm still here. I will become the house." Redfern looked up at the wallpaper. The floral print shifted slightly. A single vine moved. In the workshop, the Chronos latch activated again. Unprompted. The pen dipped. It began writing. This time faster. It's writing ahead of time, predicting. Victor leaned in. The detective confronts the truth. The writer must decide. The man with ink on his hands. He stopped. His eyes went wide. What does it say? Doesn't make it to morning. Redfern entered the study again and stopped short. A figure stood at the desk, hunched over, as though reading. It was Carmen. Or rather, something wearing Carmen's face, drawn in fine black lines like ink on vellum. Her eyes were hollow. Her smile was wrong. Did you think I'd leave the story unfinished? Back in the chamber, Iris ripped the parchment from the clamps. The pen dropped. The latch groaned. The gears stuttered. Victor shouted, "You've stopped it. You've severed the link. Or I've just taken away its map." But the ticking didn't stop. It changed pitch. A low, rhythmic sound now echoed from the floorboards, from the walls, from beneath. The ink was no longer on paper. It had soaked into the foundations. Bell Hollow itself was becoming the manuscript. And in the final moment of the chapter, the last surviving mirror in the house cracked. Not from pressure, not from age, but from a word that appeared across its surface. In dripping, black script, rewrite. Chapter 18. The House That Writes Itself. By dawn, Bell Hollow was no longer a house in the traditional sense. It had become an organism, a living, breathing entity made of wood, stone, brass, and ink. Each hallway bent subtly differently than the day before. Doors led to rooms that hadn't existed yesterday. Mirrors reflected people who weren't there. The story was no longer being written. It was being lived, and the house was the author. Iris Lane stood in the center of the great hall, the scorched fragment of the Chronos latch parchment in one hand, and a blank page in the other. The clocks on the walls had all stopped at different times. None of them matched. Some were missing hands entirely. This isn't about time anymore. It's about narrative. We're characters now, on a page with no margins. Redfern approached cautiously, the lines of fatigue etched deeper into his face than any wrinkle of age. His gun was still holstered, but useless. You couldn't shoot a story. The mirror wrote a word, rewrite. What does it mean? It means the house is giving us a choice. We can let it finish this story, or we can write an ending of our own. Victor Ellery was no longer hiding. He was searching. The hidden passages beneath the house twisted in ways he couldn't map. They shifted behind him. Familiar paths led to unfamiliar chambers. And in one of those chambers he found it. A desk, Edwin Bell's final desk, and on it, a single fresh page, blank, untouched. A quill floated above it, held in place by an unseen mechanism, trembling like it was waiting. Carmen Bell's voice whispered from nowhere, "Write well, Mr. Ellery. The house listens." Iris placed her own blank sheet on the table. If it's narrative control the latch wants, then it needs a counter-narrator, not a passive scribe, a defiant one. She picked up a pen, and she began to write. No one else dies today. The house calms, the clocks stop moving, the ink dries willingly. A deep breath seemed to pass through the beams of the house. A sigh from behind the walls. The ticking paused, the mirrors cleared, and the floor beneath the grandfather clock sealed shut, as if Carmen had never fallen. The page in Victor's room remained blank. He had not written a word. But he smiled, because he didn't need to. You changed the story. No, I finished it. In the farthest corner of Bell Hollow, a final clock ticked once, then fell silent. Its face was blank, because time no longer ruled the house. But the story? The story was finally still. Final chapter. The clockmaker's legacy. Bell Hollow stood quiet in the soft gold of morning. The fog had lifted, retreating to the treetops like a vanquished ghost. The grass glistened with dew, untouched. The windows reflected sunlight instead of secrets. And inside the house, the clocks remained silent, each one a monument to something that no longer needed to be measured. Iris Lane sat on the lowest step of the grand staircase, now with the ink-stained paper folded neatly beside her. She held a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands, untouched but comforting. I used to write stories about people who solve murders. Now I've written one where the murder unwrites itself. Redfern stood beside the hearth, looking older than he had 3 days ago. His coat hung loosely on his frame, his hands deep in his pockets, no longer searching for his notebook. I've chased killers my whole life. Now I've arrested a house. What the hell am I supposed to write in my report? Try unsolved but satisfied. Victor Ellery stood before the sealed panel that had once led to the heart of the Kronos latch. It was now just wall, flat, silent, and strangely at peace. He rested his palm on it. You weren't evil. You were just too powerful for cowards like me. He walked away. He wouldn't write again for a very long time. Eloise remained in the library, surrounded by books that no longer rearranged themselves. She had burned her notes, all of them, and for the first time in years she picked up a novel, not written by Edwin Bell. Maybe the only truth we can handle is someone else's. Carmen Bell was never found, but her room remained untouched, as though she still lived in it, as though the house remembered her. And perhaps it did, because in the quietest moments, late at night, a single chime still echoed. Not a warning, not a threat, just remembrance. Bell Hollow would never be open to guests again. It would be declared unstable, purchased quietly by a historical preservation trust, and locked behind wrought iron gates. But stories would linger. And some nights, in the nearby village, the locals would say they heard a 13th chime, soft, distant, and hollow as breath. We don't measure time here anymore. We measure what's been written and what, mercifully, has not. The end. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, ring the bell, and tell your friends about my listening library.